So tonight, the topic is freedom. And I posed the topic of the talk as a question. What does it mean to be free? And the question came up for me in part because we, as many of you know, just celebrated the 4th of July. And it occurred to me that that is not exactly a great example of freedom because freedom for one group of people meant not so much freedom for another group of people. So it was a very limited kind of freedom in which some people benefited from leaving oppression and going to a new place, but in the process, they created quite a bit of harm to the people who were already here, right? As we know. So it struck me that freedom is really at the center of Buddhist practice. It is, I sometimes say, it's the clarion call of our practice, this possibility of being free. It's the premise and the promise of walking the path. And it seems to me that the kind of freedom that we are talking about in Buddhism and through practice is a very different kind of freedom than the freedom that is suggested in a kind of the liberation that is represented by the 4th of July. Because it's not one-dimensional. It's really a kind of 360-degree kind of freedom that doesn't include my freedom over yours, that doesn't involve harm done to anyone, but is really, in a way, this kind of beautiful and very pure, in a way, expression of what freedom is. So I wanted to talk a bit about what that means. And there are many, many ways to talk about this. And I'm going to be a little bit nerdy this evening and quote from the Satipaṭṭhāna Sutta and use some Pali terms, and also talk a little about it, one of my favorite teachings, which is called the Upādānas. So I would just ask you to bear with me a bit for those of you who it may feel a little bit dry or academic. It's not intended in that way at all. But I think sometimes it's really helpful to take a close look at some of the original teachings and to look carefully at the language that's used as a way to help us clarify, in this case, what exactly is it that we're talking about? So some of you may know the Satipaṭṭhāna Sutta is usually translated as the 4 foundations of mindfulness, and it is the primary text that's used in the Western convert Buddhist insight meditation tradition. So if you go to an insight meditation retreat, most places, you will receive meditation instruction that is grounded or based in some way in this text, the 4 foundations of mindfulness. And really what it is pointing to is instruction for what we pay attention to. So there's 4 Satipaṭṭhanas, 4 different ways of paying attention, or paying attention to what? So the first Satipaṭṭhāna is that we pay attention to the body and breath. And it's not that the body and breath is better than anything else, but it's super useful to pay attention to the body and breath because the body and breath are always here. They're always in the present. And also, for most of us, when we're moving through our days in the life of the world, we often lose contact with the body and breath. So it's helpful. It's kind of a reminder. Oh, right, this. And then the second Satipaṭṭhāna is what is called Vedana, or feeling tone. It's sometimes translated as feeling, but it's not really feeling. It's feeling tone. And I'll talk about this a little bit more, but the idea is that every moment of experience has a valence, a flavor to it. And there's only three flavors: pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. And as you'll see, this becomes important to understanding what freedom is. Because most of the time, we're in an ongoing state of reactivity to our pleasant and unpleasant experience. And freedom is about unhooking from that. It doesn't mean, and I'll say much more about this, that we only have pleasant experience and we get rid of all the unpleasant experience. I think that's the fantasy version of what we hope practice will be, but that's not what practice is. It's about always learning to relate to our experience in a different way. So we can notice, pay attention to the breath and body. We can notice and pay attention to the feeling tone, pleasant or unpleasant or neutral tone of our experience. And then we can pay attention to the mind. And really, in Buddhist psychology, by mind, we mean thoughts and emotions, both. They're understood to be connected. And if you pay attention to your direct experience, you will see how connected they are, right? The thought creates a feeling creates a thought. They're very woven in that way. And we in our language distinguish them, but they often go together. So we can pay attention to the content of mind. And then the fourth foundation of mindfulness is what's called dhammas. And dhammas are basically everything else I think of. It's in the Buddhist context, it's all the lists of things. And it's things like noticing the hindrances, the things that get in the way. It's noticing the things that support our practice. It's noticing, I think of the fourth foundation of mindfulness as it's having us start to notice patterns of experience. That's not the technical way that it's described, but it's the way that I think of it. But here's the thing. I believe that the key to freedom, as it's talked about in the Buddhist path, is less about what we pay attention to than it is how we pay attention. I'm going to say the same thing. This is the whole deal, what I'm saying right here. I'm going to say it over and over in a bunch of different ways. It's not what we pay attention to. It's not the content of our awareness, but it is the attitude we bring to our experience. Or we might say it is our relationship to our experience. That's what we're cultivating. And that shift, that cultivation is very, very powerful. The opening line of the Satipaṭṭhāna Sutta says, and I will quote liberally here, but it says basically, there is a way, a direct path. And then it says, for these things, for the purification of beings, for the overcoming of sorrow and lamentation, for the ending of suffering and grief, for finding a true method, and for attaining nibbana, enlightenment, freedom, peace. So right at the beginning of the sutta, it says, if you do this, if you practice this way, here's what's possible. If you're anything like me, you hear that and you go, ooh. But I think that, as I was pointing to a moment ago, we're a little bit mixed up about what this means. And that most of us, what we think if we practice this way, is that we think we're going to have only good experience and we're going to get rid of all the bad experience. This is the fantasy version, as I said. It's what I like to call the version of what many of us carry around in our mind as the island where it all works out. And lots of us spent some time on that island in the material world, where we thought, oh, if I only fill in the blank, then I can get to that place where I'll be happy. If only I have enough money, if only I have the right partner, if only I have a house, if only I have the right shoes, if only I had a different body, if only I blah, 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 right? And then lots of people catch on that doesn't really work. And so then we transfer that same attitude to spiritual practice. And we think, oh, if only I can quiet my mind. If only I can sit still. If only I can have deep concentration. If only. So do you see how we take the same attitude, that kind of grasping, wanting mind, and we translate it from kind of the external to the internal? Same attitude, though. And fundamentally, this freedom that we're talking about is not about getting what we want. It's about shifting our relationship, shifting our attitude toward what's happening. And the basic description of suffering in Buddhist teaching is that moment by moment, we are bombarded through our sense doors. And there are 6 of them. There's the eyes and the ears and the nose and the mouth, seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, sensing, hearing, seeing, smelling, hearing, seeing, tasting, touching, smelling. And the mind is considered a sense organ. So thinking is a sensory experience. The mind is a sense organ. So moment by moment, we're being bombarded by experience, and every moment of experience is pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. That's just how it is. And you don't have to believe me. You can check this out for yourself. And our fundamental suffering is that moment by moment, as this experience arrives in our psychosomatic being, we react to it. If it's pleasant, we grab on. And if it's unpleasant, we push away. If it's pleasant, we want it, we like it, we want it, we grasp it, we hold it, we cling to it. If we don't like it, we don't want it, we try to push it away or ignore it or deny it or put it like that. And that this is a non-mindful strategy. This is a reactive strategy, a habitual strategy. It's what we do automatically. Right? It's not necessarily a bad thing. If you touch a hot stove, ouch, you pull your hand away. That's okay. But if this is our strategy for wanting to be free or wanting to be happy, I always like to say it doesn't actually make you happy. What it makes you is very tired, because it's constant. Or constant kind of reverb. And if you go from the grasping and aversion that we do in our daily life to starting to notice that in a quieter situation in your meditation, you can actually begin to feel that reverb. You can begin to feel how it is that moment by moment we're liking and not liking, wanting and not wanting, leaning in and leaning away. That's not stillness. That's not peace. That's not freedom. It's being caught. And I think it's important to say here before I say more, which I will, that I'm not suggesting that what is needed instead is a kind of passivity. I'm not suggesting that if you touch a hot stove that you should leave your hand there. I'm not suggesting that if you see harm or injustice in the world that you shouldn't do something about it. What I am saying is that the where that we come from makes a difference. And that when we are reacting, when we're in reaction, there's just not freedom there. And that our responses tend to be habitual, not very creative, not very inspired, and often not very helpful. Sometimes they're helpful. It is also the case that for many of us, while it makes sense to take yourself out of a difficult situation if you can. It makes sense to put yourself in a happy-making situation if you can. But part of the story of Siddhartha Gautama and what led him to his spiritual path was the recognition of these kind of existential difficulties that we call 3 of the 4 heavenly messengers: old age, sickness, and death. And none of us will escape that. So there is a way in which the practice is also preparing us for something that no matter how good we get at getting and getting away from, you're not going to succeed there. This is true for all of us as human beings. So in all of this way, our practice is preparing us not so much to get better at following the reactive patterns that we have. It's teaching us this radical reorientation to our experience itself. It cuts so deep, I think. This, am I doing it right or wrong? This, if only I, then. But it is, I think, what's being pointed to in this teaching. The Venerable Analayo, who I'm going to start quoting a bunch, who wrote this book. If you haven't taken a look at it, I highly recommend it. He did this translation of the Satipaṭṭhāna, of this sutta, and he describes that the 4 Satipaṭṭhānas that I just described, the 4 foundations of mindfulness, are not a what but a how. And again, this is the whole deal. We think we're going to get a what, but the whole path is about shifting the how. And interestingly, it describes what that how might look like in this text. And what's described is not just the 4 Satipaṭṭhanas, which are what we pay attention to, but also the attitude with which we are instructed to meet any of those 4. And this is pretty interesting. I think it's interesting because it's not the part of the sutta that gets taught most often, but it's essential. So what is that how? What is the attitude that the Buddha describes? And this is the part that will get a little bit technical, so bear with me. Just as he describes 4 Satipaṭṭhanas, he also describes 4 attitudes. And I'll name them first. If you are a note taker, you can write these down and then I'll riff on them. So the 4 are, the first is called Atapi, A-T-A-P-I. The second is called Sampajana, Sampajana. The third is Sati, which probably you all know. Sati is mindfulness. And the fourth is Vinaya, Vineyya. And if you take a close look, which I did, but I did through the benefit of Venerable Analayo's extensive scholarship, it's really interesting to see what it is that's being suggested, the how of how we're being instructed to pay attention. So the first term, atapi, A-T-A-P-I, is translated as diligent. It's often described as ardent. In the Zen tradition, we would call it wholeheartedness. It's a kind of dedication and a like being willing to really throw ourselves into, give ourselves over to. It's a sort of has a devotional feeling to it. And interestingly, Analayo describes that this is in distinction to, in the time of the Buddha, the main attitude was very much more one of asceticism and renunciation. And so this attitude is in distinction to that. He's not saying that the attitude we should have is to be aversive toward our experience. He's saying, no, the attitude that we want to have is to be wholehearted, to be ardent, to be dedicated, as he was. You know, many of you, the story of Siddhartha Gautama, who traveled and visited from teacher to teacher and learned all kinds of different things and wasn't satisfied until he knew for himself. He found this sense of freedom. And what's important in the story is that he didn't give up. He didn't, go to the first teacher and it didn't cut it for him and he said, oh, well, forget it. This is important for us, especially I think for those of us in the West who tend to be very impatient, right? It may take a while. And so this quality of dedication, of devotion, of wholeheartedness, it's really important. The second quality is sampajana, and it is clearly knowing or clear comprehension. And it's close to mindfulness, but a little bit different. It's really, it's described that the cause of our fundamental suffering is actually ignorance, the opposite of clear knowing, of clear understanding. And that it's out of ignorance that we are engaged in this constant process of grasping and aversion. Because we really think that if we can get what we want, it will make us happy. And we really think if we can get away from what we don't want, that it will make us happy, which it may temporarily, but it won't make us free. And this is what is the proposal, that we can actually be free. And in order to be free, we have to uproot the fundamental misunderstanding of our separateness, of our felt sense of separation, which in some descriptions of Buddhist teaching and really what it means to be human is understood as our most fundamental suffering. You can check this out again for yourself. How many of you feel suffering that comes from pain in the body, or suffering that comes from not getting what you want, or having to be around something you don't want, or the suffering that comes from everything being transitory? All of those are kinds of suffering. But there's this other suffering that cuts so deep for us as humans, which is that we feel separate. We may feel this as, I don't fit in. Nobody understands me. I'm not like other people. Like that. any degree of that kind of alienation. That's one of the core kinds of suffering that we have. So this sampajana, this clear seeing, is really at the heart. And it's interesting to me that the confusion is understood in this teaching as the core of our suffering, because it means that, in contrast to many Western spiritual traditions, which has evil at the center, it's not evil here, it's ignorance. Buddhism doesn't say you're fundamentally bad and you need to clean up your act. Buddhism said you are fundamentally good, but you're confused. And so this sampajana, this clear seeing, this clear understanding, you can begin to get a taste of how important it is for us to really understand how things are. Because as long as we're confused, we're going to continue to suffer. So this isn't sampajana, clear knowing or comprehending in some kind of academic bookish way. It's very fundamental. It's a kind of existential understanding who we really are. And then sati. And one of the things I love most about this book, Analayo's book, is that he really breaks down and describes in some detail the roots of the term sati, of what we translate as mindfulness. And as many of you know, mindfulness has become very, very popular. And essentially everything these days is I need to be mindful about this, that, and the other thing, which essentially means I need to pay attention, I need to be aware of, like that. I need to be mindful. But mindful has some really interesting roots to it. The word sati has some really interesting roots to it. And one, as some of you may have heard, one of the roots is sarati, which means to remember. And I love this as part of mindfulness because remembering is not about getting somewhere. And we, especially, I think, those of us in capitalist countries, we are so geared to get somewhere. Hang on a minute. Hey, sweetie. Someone just came home, so he had to protect the domicile. So remember is about to remember, is to make whole. But the term re, which is true in remember or return or even refuge, that re means again. And I love this because it points us in this kind of reorientation that the path is pointing us to, which is that we're not trying to get somewhere else. It's this coming home. So to remember, and mindfulness is this, we're not being mindful so that, we're being mindful because being mindful returns us here. One of my favorite descriptions of this sati as sarati, to remember, is that what is it that we're remembering? In some versions of it, it's described that it's Ananda, who was the Buddha's attendant, who had this great memory, who remembered all of his words. So that's one version of the story. But fundamentally, what we're remembering is now. That's what we're being invited. That's what mindful remembering is. It's remembering here, 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 now. One of the other root definitions of the word sati is from anupasati. And I love this description because anupasati literally means to repeatedly see. And it has that quality of kind of dedication and wholeheartedness and devotion, right? It's being willing to see again and again. And to repeatedly see, in English, we have the word respect. Respect, spect is like spectacles. So respected means literally to look again. And I think it's beautiful if we see, to repeatedly see. It tells us, no, we want to be willing to not just look at the surface of things, to not just see a person and immediately judge, but to be willing to stay with, to be with, to see through the surface into the complexity, the depth of our own experience, of other people, of the world, like that. The other piece that I got this time from reading Analayo's text is that he describes these three different, I think they would be called metaphors, that the Buddha uses to describe mindfulness. And one is that the kind of seeing, the kind of attention that we pay and when we're being mindful is as if looking from a tower, which on one hand could feel like it's kind of, up high and far away, but it's also a very wide view, right? We're taking a very comprehensive view of what we're seeing. That's one metaphor. The other one is, or another one is that we are paying attention as if we're taming a wild elephant. And this is really the one that sort of points to the patience that's needed, right? Both care, but also it doesn't happen just once. Any of you who've ever trained a pet know, right? You have to repeat, repeat, repeat. Same with a kid when they're learning. This has that quality to it. And then the third metaphor that he uses is like a surgeon's knife, which suggests like very precise and careful. So all of these give you kind of the flavors of the quality of mindfulness. So again, we're shifting from not just what we're mindful of, but what are those qualities that mindfulness, that we bring to the mindfulness itself, right? What's the attitude? And then the fourth, this vinaya, is described as free from desires and discontent in regard to the world. And this really points back to that grasping and aversion, that we're free from that. And it's really important here that free from doesn't mean they don't arise. This is the fantasy version. Free from means they're going to arise. We are absolutely, if you're a human being with functioning sensory equipment, you're going to be bombarded by pleasant and unpleasant experience all day long. And you're going to like some of it and you're not going to like some of it. Where you have a choice is, do I pleasant, I like it, I want it. Oh, I don't have to hold on. Or I hope, oh, that hurts, and then I can let go. When we're mindful, we can begin to have some choice. That's what's meant by freedom here. That we don't have to be caught inevitably, always in this habit pattern. I love that this last part of the kind of attitude is also about not what we get, but it's pointing to the absence of something. And much of the Dharma and much of what's pointed to in the Dharma as freedom is about that. Sometimes it's said that the Buddha never said what enlightenment is. He just described, here's what it's the absence of. And we are so geared toward looking for the thing that we can so easily miss the absence of. We don't even have language for it. But I would invite you and me and all of us to start to pay attention and notice, where are those moments when there's no greed, when there's no grasping? What's a moment like when there's no aversion? What's it like that? It's much more subtle. And this is the territory that the practice invites us into. This is what it means to invite us to be devoted, to be wholehearted, to be dedicated, to repeatedly see, so that we can begin to see the subtlety of what binds us. And we can begin to have the capacity to notice when there are moments of freedom, because there are, but we miss them a lot. I said before that we have these three flavors of Vedana: pleasant, unpleasant, and the third is neutral. And neutral experience is sometimes described as neither pleasant or unpleasant. And for most of us, this is certainly true for me, we just miss it. We miss neutral experience. Or we say, oh, that was boring. Right? We kind of zone out. We miss it. Unless it's loud, and kind of aggressively pleasant or aggressively unpleasant. And in order to catch on, we have to turn up the volume, right? But again, the practice is inviting us to start to notice more subtlety. There's a lot of freedom there. So the last piece that I want to say before I'm almost done here is to say that there is this kind of secondary teaching that I find super duper helpful in my own practice, which is the teaching of the Upādānas. And there are, just as there are 4 foundations of mindfulness and these 4 qualities with which we can meet our experience, the 4 Upādānas point us to these 4 categories of what it is we grasp onto. And I find this really helpful for myself to pay attention to. So what are the 4? The first is that we tend to grasp pleasant sensory experience. This is the most obvious. We like things that taste good. We like things that are beautiful. We like things that smell good, and so on. We like pleasant thoughts. The other 3 aren't quite as obvious, but they're really important to notice, because we aren't really free until we're free of these other pieces. So the second Upādāna is what is called views and opinions. Anybody have some of those? Anybody notice the state of our world right now? Where we just have views and opinions going like this, right? Because everybody's holding so tightly to their view and opinion. And then we have just constant division, divisiveness, bigger and bigger gap. People having to shout across the chasm of difference and nobody really listening. So sometimes we don't even know we have a view or an opinion until we bump up against something or somebody with a different one, right? But for me, I find that the bumping up against and the beginning to see and see clearly my views and opinions is a gold mine for liberation. Because those views and opinions are held very tightly by me. And they cause a lot of suffering for me and for other people. The third Upādāna, which is a really interesting one, is what's called rites and rituals. And I think at the time of the Buddha, he was pushing up against the Brahmanic religion, which was a lot about ritual and making sacrificial offerings and so on. And in our world, we don't have much ceremony and ritual in that same kind of way. But we do have a lot of habit, right? We have the way that we drive to work in the morning, or we have the way that we make our coffee in the morning, or the way that we, whatever it is. And it's really an interesting place to practice, to start to intentionally change up some of those habits that we have, just to see what happens. That's an interesting place to practice. And finally, the last one is the sense of I, me, and mine. And this, of course, goes to the heart of what we're being freed from in Buddhist practice. And it doesn't mean that we become nothing, but it does mean that those ideas, and embedded in the idea of I, me, and mine, are all of our habits and rituals and our views and opinions and what we like and don't like. All of that is all tangled together. And you don't have to give it up. You just have to see it for what it is. These are the places you can look. And then you bring those attitudes that I was describing, of diligence, of ardency, of clear seeing, of mindfulness. You bring those attitudes to your observation rather than, judgment. Right, wrong, good, bad. Never says that anywhere in any Buddhist teaching that you should be doing that. No, it says you pay attention and you notice for yourself and you begin to see. And as you see clearly in this way, there's more and more freedom. It means you don't have to follow the habit. It means you don't have to hold on to the view. It means you start to see that your idea of yourself is so limited compared to your actual experience, right? This is freedom.